Welcome to today's lecture on conservation biology. Today we're going to focus on some of the principles of conservation biology, and then later we'll focus on climate change as we delve deeper into the topic. So we visited the IUCN's website earlier in the semester to learn about different species that were under threat of extinction. And IUCN has a list of what they consider the major threats. And remember, the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So they list habitat loss and degradation as the top problem, invasive alien species, then overexploitation of natural resources such as hunting or fishing, pollution and diseases, and then human-induced climate change. So we're going to talk about some of these and how they've led to species going extinct in the past. So if we look at the state of Michigan, for example, we can find some bird species that are pretty familiar to us. We see things as we go around the forest here in Michigan that we're pretty familiar with and we recognize pretty quickly, like the American robin pictured in the upper right or the blue jay pictured in the upper left. Now, this plays a role in whether these species then become vulnerable to extinction. And it's hard to imagine something like the American robin being driven to extinction because we see them everywhere. Now, the history of North America, though, is that we've had pretty substantial environmental degradation over time. Here you see logging in the Pacific Northwest, but this type of logging occurred in Michigan as well, where massive amounts of the forests of Michigan were cut down in order to build cities, especially Michigan being cut down to rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire of the 1890s. If we look at North America and its forest cover, we see that in 1620, before European conquest really overtook North America, that most of the eastern part of the North America was forest cover. If we jump forward to 1850, we can see that a lot of this forest had been cut down, and only in the very east coast, only small patches of forest remained, and even this deforestation had started to reach Michigan. And as we jump forward to 1926, we see that deforestation has severely impacted most of the United States, and most of the primary forest that was here in 1620 is gone and has been replaced either with agriculture or allowed to grow back into what's called secondary forest. So as we think about this, we want to ask the question about what did this massive amount of deforestation do in terms of driving species extinct? And what we see is that only a handful of species went extinct. The passenger pigeon in 1899, the Carolina parakeet disappeared from the wild in 1901, 1945 was the last credible sighting of an ivory-billed woodpecker, and 1984 was when Bachman's warbler went extinct, although some people say 1988 was the extinction date for Bachman's warbler. So we lost 99% of the old-growth forest in eastern North America. And so out of 200 breeding bird species, though, in these forests, only 4 went extinct. So the question is, how does 99% deforestation lead to only 2% extinction? Because we'd expect it to be a much higher amount of species lost. So part of this lies in some keys from early naturalists in the United States, and one of those is John James Audubon, the person after whom the Audubon Society is named, and a well-known painter who illustrated the birds of North America. And he stated it is somewhat strange that among the numerous species of birds that visit the United States, a few should have been met with only in rare instances. Okay, this is a very strangely worded quote, but if you read Audubon stuff, you kind of get the gist of what he's saying. And what he's saying here is that of all the birds that he encountered in the United States, very few of them were rare species. Almost all of them were common species. And so because all these species were common, he found it unlikely that they might get driven to extinction. So we think about these species, the American robin, the blue jay, the cardinal, and the black-capped chickadee, and we can see that they have a pretty big population at the national level. The black-capped chickadee ranges from Alaska to the maritime provinces and down into the central states, and is an abundant bird in most of its range. The American robin has an even more substantial range, shown here with its breeding range in red and purple. And you can see that it breeds as far as the Arctic Circle, across the entire continent, and then all the way down into Mexico. And so to drive a species like this extinct would require a lot of damage to the habitat throughout that range. And if we think about why those more species didn't go extinct, the other piece of this is, if we think about those wide ranges the birds have, most of the deforestation before 1750 occurred on the East Coast. Between 1750 and 1850 occurred just west of that in western New York and Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. And then 1850 to 1920, Michigan, Wisconsin, northern Ohio lost a lot of their forest. And then since then, a lot of the deforestation has been in the Pacific Northwest. Now, if we focus on the eastern part of the country, what we see is that area that was deforested before 1750, by the time Michigan was being deforested, a lot of that had grown back. So if we lost all the chickadees that were in Michigan, we wouldn't have been losing the chickadees that were in Massachusetts, where the forest had grown back. And so that large range that these species has really protects them. Now, what about the species that we did lose? The Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon are two examples, and I'm going to focus on the passenger pigeon as an example of a very alarming loss of a species. So the passenger pigeon was larger than our mourning dove, a fairly large dove species, and in the year 1800, it was North America's most abundant bird. So take a second to think about that. Most abundant bird in North America in 1800. Remember, by 1899, it was extinct in the wild. Some estimate that it was the most abundant terrestrial vertebrate species on the planet, so more abundant than rats, more abundant than anything you can imagine. John James Audubon, who I mentioned earlier, was a naturalist, and he observed these flocks of birds migrating, and when the passenger pigeon came through, he noted that it darkened the sky. So he says in a quote here, "I dismounted, seated myself on an eminence, and began to mark with my pencil, making a dot for every flock that passed. In a short time, finding the task I had undertaken impracticable, as the birds poured in countless multitudes, I rose, and counting the dots then put down, I found that 163 had been made in 21 minutes. I traveled on and still met more the farther I proceeded. The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as by an eclipse, and the dung fell in spots not unlike the melting flakes of snow, and the continued buzz of wings had a tendency to lull my senses." So he says here that the shadow cast by the migrating pigeons was darkening the sky the same way that an eclipse would. And that's pretty amazing to think of birds migrating in such numbers that it seems like a dark cloud passing over, or even the moon passing between the earth and the sun. People hunted the pigeons pretty extensively in their migration, and just firing a shot into the air would bring down a large number of pigeons, and it seemed like an inexhaustible resource. So again, Audubon's flock, it passed over for 3 days, he reported, and as based on his estimates, as many as 300 million birds came by in a single hour, and that leads to estimates that there were between 3 and 9 billion passenger pigeons in North America, equivalent to about 25 to 40% of all the breeding bird species in North America. So if we look at the timeline for this, it's very alarming. So 1813 was when Audubon saw this flock, and this was the most abundant bird in North America at that time. In 1870s, the railroads moved into the Midwest, which was the area where the passenger pigeon was most common. And that allowed hunters to ship passenger pigeons back to the East Coast for food very rapidly. In 1878, the populations had declined enough that Michigan was considered the last real stronghold. In a single year, 3 million passenger pigeons were shipped eastward by a group of hunters. By 1899, they were extinct in Michigan and extinct in the wild. And the bird we see here, pictured in the lower right, is Martha, the last passenger pigeon, who died on September 1st, 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. So essentially within 100 years of Audubon seeing his massive flock, the passenger pigeon was no more. Now, what brought down the passenger pigeon? So massive levels of hunting, evidenced by 3 million birds being shipped east by a group of hunters. Massive amounts of hunting on the breeding grounds, which then led to a complete disruption of their breeding cycle. This then led to a downfall of the passenger pigeon and its eventual extinction. So there's some lessons to be learned here, and one of them is that even the most abundant bird species can be driven to extinction. And even the most abundant species we see on our planet, like the squirrels we see on campus or the American robins, might be driven to extinction if humans aren't careful about the way they manage resources. Now, conservation biology gives us principles to manage wildlife and ecosystems. And in future classes, I really strongly encourage you to take a course on conservation biology where you can learn a lot about how we can protect the natural world and live in better harmony with it.